Awesome. Well, it's 5 o'clock, so I'll get started. Hi, I'm Anna Marquise, Civic Engagement Coordinator, and welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. And that's never been more important than it is right now. I'd like to hand things over to Jen Simon, ESPC's Senior Policy Advisor, to give us a quick overview of housekeeping, give us some voter information, and introduce today's panelists.
Thanks, Anna. And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to our panelists for joining us. We're excited to get started. You are all probably Zoom experts by now, but just a quick overview of housekeeping for tonight. Everybody in our audience is muted automatically. We will be posting resources in the chat feature. We'd love for you to post questions in the chat feature, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. We've got questions for our panelists, and we'll try and add yours in. If you have any tech issues at all, Anna is your person. She will help you out. Hopefully, even though you are not visible to us and you are not visible to each other, we are visible and audible to you. If we are not, now is the time to get in touch with Anna. I want to kind of preface this, which is probably our most timely People's Review live to date. We're talking about the power of voting with some national and state election experts. Voting is already well underway. Election day is less than 3 weeks away. We're 19 days out. And at a time of unprecedented challenges, what's being done to ensure that all voices are heard, all votes are counted? So we want to start out tonight with a quick reminder from us that you can vote early in person. You can vote early absentee. You can vote the day of at the polls. If you still need to register to vote, you can do that too. More information about how to do all of that is available on our website and on the Secretary of State's website. Those links will be in the chat as we go through the evening. And we did invite Secretary of State Ed Buchanan and Elections Director Kai Schon to join us. Their office is understandably extraordinarily busy right about now. So their team actually worked with us and sent along some information and some answers to questions that we've heard from all of you, we've heard from panelists, and our team put together. So some of that information will be integrated into the discussion tonight. All of it will be available on our website. The other thing we want you to know, your county clerk is the hero of this election. Yes. And so they are an extraordinary source of information about your local elections. They can tell you your polling place, answer questions about your registration, about local polls, local ballots, basically any hometown question you have related to voting, your county clerk has the answer. So call them up. They are ready for your questions and they are excited to answer them. And we will come back to saying over and over, county clerks are the heroes of this election. So we're excited that these voting rights experts are here to talk with us about voting rights in Wyoming, why our elections are safe and secure. They'll dispel some myths and help us think about policies that will enable Wyomingites to participate more fully in our democracy. And so it's my pleasure to introduce all of our panelists and then get into some questions. So Ricardo Ramirez is a voting rights advisor in the Voting Rights and Elections program of at the Brennan Center for Justice. And he's the founder and principal of Forward Shift Strategies, a communications consulting firm. He has more than a decade of communications work, and he brings high-level experience, for electoral campaigns, democracy, and social justice efforts. He's originally from Puerto Rico, and he got his start through years of work in political press offices, including the US Senate. He's served as a regional press secretary and Latino communications director. Welcome, Ricardo. Audrey Kline is the National Policy Director for the National Vote at Home Institute. She spent nearly 3 years working in the Colorado State Senate before going to work for Colorado's AFL-CIO. And in 2017, she shifted her focus to nonpartisan leadership development. She's passionate about civic engagement and good governance and is excited to share her home state's groundbreaking voting model with the rest of the nation. And we're excited for that information here in Wyoming. So welcome, Audrey. Susan Simpson is president of the Wyoming League of Women Voters. She was the Albany County Librarian for 23 years, and in that capacity, she worked with the Laramie League on forums at the public library. She's been an election judge for more than 20 years, and we'll talk a little bit more with her about that tonight. As a Laramie League member and state president, she's been a tireless advocate for making registration and voting accessible to qualified Wyoming residents. Welcome, Susan. And our very own Chris Merrill joined the Equality State Policy Center as the executive director in 2018. He was previously the associate director and communications director at the Wyoming Outdoor Council. Prior to that, he was an award-winning journalist with the Casper Star Tribune and the Idaho State Journal. So thanks, Chris, for sitting on the panel with us. And welcome to you all. And Chris, I actually want to start with you. Why does voting really matter in Wyoming?
Well, thank you. And thanks for having all of us. This is great. And by the way, I have some very loud children, and you might hear them in the background. Why does voting matter? It's the most basic thing, right? This is what this whole American experiment is all about. It's the most basic and direct way that we as a people can exercise power over our government. You know, it's how ultimately we protect our rights as citizens. It's how we bring about policies that benefit the people. And it is, it's an honor and it's a privilege to vote, but it's also, you know, our duty as citizens to vote. And if we don't show up, we don't vote, like a lot of people in Wyoming and throughout the country don't show up and don't vote, then those voices are not heard on election day. And it hurts the system, it hurts policymaking, and the more people that show up, the more people that turn out, the better the system works. So it's one of the most basic foundational elements of this representative democracy that we live in. And I'm thankful to be part of it, and I hope that everyone out there goes out and votes.
Well, thank you, Chris. And Susan, I want to turn to you because your work with the League of Women Voters works to make sure that voters are informed and engaged. And I know from talking with you that you're a firm believer in celebrating participation as a voter and participation in democracy. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit, what are the biggest obstacles to voting in Wyoming? How do we overcome them and engage more people with our democracy?
I think that there are two major impediments to voting in Wyoming. Some impediments are structural and others are individual. For instance, our laws are complicated, and so people don't always understand how they work. And so the person says, oh, well, I voted here last year, and so they run to vote there again, and they don't understand that because they moved, they're not voting there, and they need to be at work in 20 minutes. And they didn't have a plan, and they didn't think about it ahead of time, and so they're stymied by what's going on. They don't understand that they will be purged if they didn't vote in the general election. They don't understand about closed primaries. The number of voters who come in during primaries and take an unaffiliated ballot and look at it, and in Laramie at any rate, it has the city council members on it, and they say, the person I want to vote for isn't here. And that's because you're unaffiliated. If you want to vote for someone associated with a party, you have to be registered in that party. That's an example of a structural impediment for people. People don't understand that if they have a disability, there are machines that will help them read a larger screen, listen to a video. We'll do curbside voting if you want. Call us up and we'll carry the ballot out to you so you can vote. There are, and that's an example of an individual thing that can interfere with somebody's voting. You need to have the IDs to register to vote. And if you're strapped for money, sometimes you can't afford to purchase the identification that you need to be able to register. Okay, those are just some, and no one's interrupting. I'm sure that you've thought of others as I talked. I don't mean to hog the.
No, I appreciate all of those answers, Susan. And I think that we'll come back to some of them too as we move through this conversation. I want to sort of get us to a place where we can talk about some of the policies as well. So this is a great way to kick it off, and especially to take it and then move it over to you, Audrey. Colorado has pro-voter policies and consistently has among the highest voter turnout in the country. We'll drop a great link from your organization's website about primary turnout and how well Colorado and Montana do. Wyoming doesn't do quite as well, but could you talk a little bit about some of the pro-voter policies in place in Colorado, but then also what are the impacts of having more options for how people can cast their vote? How does that bear out in real life?
Sure. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about all of it. Thank you for having me. I think to start sort of here in Colorado with what we created in the changes that we made in 2013 had been sort of a progression. I think it's important to know that we really made a jump there, but we had a really high instance and tradition of voting by mail already. I think in 2020, we're seeing so many states shift in a way that like, this is just not how things are gonna work anymore. But in Colorado, what we did is that we decided that it was safer, cheaper, more accessible, more efficient, you name it, to just mail everyone a ballot. And we made that possible by sort of coupling it with a lot of other pieces of policy that are important to get that done. So we have same-day voter registration. We use voter service and polling centers instead of traditional in-person polling places. So you can vote anywhere in your county. You don't have to go to your specific school or church or whatnot to vote. You can go anywhere. So if it's closer to work, you're happy to have you there. And so when you couple all of these different policy pieces together, what you see is a massive increase in turnout for everyone across the board. And I think it's really important to mention that it's not a partisan breakdown on that. It's across the board. You see about 8 points here in Colorado for both Democrats and Republicans. But then you also see these traditionally disenfranchised groups that are getting these bigger jumps. So you're seeing younger voters, people of color, anyone that has sort of like is lower on the education scale, you're seeing blue collar voters, and all of this is just making the process more accessible and more efficient. And honestly, it's getting people further down the ballot, which I think is super important. So you see massive growth across the whole system, and we're just so excited to be sharing those results across the country.
I appreciate that. And we're definitely going to come back and dig into a couple of those things, especially the jumps in how people, different groups of people engage. And Ricardo, I want to shift to you in this part. You and I have talked about this before. Voting is a core civil rights issue, and your work throughout your career has borne this out. I want to sort of pick up on what Audrey is saying and talk a little bit more and hear from you. What are the benefits of greater voter turnout and participation? And then I also want to talk about the flip side of that, right? What does voter disenfranchisement look like? And we can pick that up with everybody, but let's start with what are the benefits and to whom?
Right. Thank you, Jen, and thanks to ESPC for putting this conversation together. Well, I think I look at voting from a values perspective, and I think we know for a fact that there are decisions being made on our behalf at every moment, every day in the halls of power, from your city council to your county to the governor's mansion. And the question is whether you are going to shape that and participate in that and bring your neighbors and your family and your community along, or you're going to leave a vacuum for others to fill for you. So what happens is when more people vote, the decisions that happen, the policies that are put into place look more like what people actually want it to look like, and less what whoever paid for that politician wants it to look like. So it's really important. And, you know, we could get into lots of different examples and threads within that, but I think that's the frame with which I look at it. Yeah, I mean, I think if the flip side of that means that, I mean, I think we're starting to see that in some places where what we see is that some, let's say, large, special, high-powered interests are not able to persuade the public on their points of view. Maybe they want to decrease taxes for the very wealthiest while raising it for the middle class. Maybe they want to stick a nuclear waste dump right in your backyard. When they can't make something like nuclear waste popular or fracking popular, what happens is they try to cut off avenues to democracy. And, you know, it doesn't look like what it looked like in the 60s or before. Now, I like to say that voter suppression wears a suit and tie, and it's done behind closed doors, and it's all about process. If you insert this obligatory step in the way, if you require this kind of ID, but not that kind of ID, then you start shaping the electorate and bending it to your will and deciding who gets to vote instead of it being the other way around and voters deciding who gets to shape democracy.
I so appreciate that framing, the values-based framing, but also, you know, your point about how the process can shape the electorate and not the other way around. I'd actually be curious if, Susan, you wanted to weigh in on what kind of obstacles. I was gonna get to this question later, but I'm gonna get to it now because we've raised the issue of voter ID all of a sudden, right? And that is a bill that we see over and over again in the state of Wyoming. Before I pose the question about the voter ID piece, I want to go to some of the responses that we got from the Secretary of State's office, including sort of the question of fraud, because that is sort of a pivotal conversation that's been happening across the country and in Wyoming. And what we heard from Election Director Schon is there have been very few instances of fraud since he's taken the role. I believe that that's true. Before he took the role, he could only cite one, and no cases of voter impersonation or deceased voters voting, any of the things that you sort of typically hear about. And so he does point out how minimal fraud is and how safe things are. So I want to use that as sort of a springboard for this conversation about voter ID. If we know that there isn't really any instance of fraud, why is it then, Susan, do you think that every single session we see a voter ID bill? And what are the implications of that? Who does that impact, and what does it really do?
Okay, you've mentioned a couple of points, and so I'm going to hit a couple back. I am a retired librarian, and I did a literature search looking for voter fraud in Wyoming, and the press doesn't report very many instances of voter fraud. So, in Cheyenne, 6 people who were felons who haven't had their rights restored voted. In Fremont County, it was 4. Okay, the county attorneys are not prosecuting these cases, and so it's not impersonation. It's not busloads of people coming up from Colorado to vote in Wyoming. The people who, you hit a sore point, the people who say these things have no idea what's involved in voting. You don't just walk in and say, "Hi, I'm here, give me a ballot." You have to have an address. The address determines which ballot you get. It's much more complicated than these people think. You're barcoded, for instance. So if you're an absentee voter and a ballot comes in, they want your barcode. They look and see what your signature is like, and does it match on the envelope? I'm digressing from voter ID. People, I think there's a lot of privilege going on with voter laws. People assume that everyone is like them. So if they carry a wallet or a purse all the time, they assume that everybody carries a wallet or a purse, or that everybody has a driver's license, or that everybody has a birth certificate, and it's not true. There's a lot of variety in the stories of people's lives and in the legal documents that they have to support who they are, for instance. And so when you register to vote in Wyoming, you have to have an ID to register. And there's a list of IDs that are appropriate. But people don't necessarily carry those IDs with them when they go to vote. If they walk past the polling place and they're strolling along with their baby and their diaper bag, their ID might be at home, right? So you're going to make that person trottle home, get the ID, and come back, particularly in places like Laramie. There are over 16,000 registered voters in Laramie, and most of the election judges work in precincts where they live. So it's a case of saying hi to the woman who lives across the street and hi, Miles, to her son. It's not a big city issue. I just got off my soapbox.
We love your soapbox, and I appreciate the perspective on voter ID, and I want to also talk about, like, while we're in this space of fraud, I wish that we weren't, but it seems to be sort of in the general gestalt right now. But Audrey, there's been lots of talk about maybe increased likelihood of fraud with absentee ballots. There's lots of evidence that shows that that's not true. I'd love for you to talk about it especially from the perspective of the National Vote at Home Institute and the state of Colorado, where everyone gets a mail-in ballot. Can you talk a little bit about absentees and the safety of that?
Absolutely. And, I sort of, while Susan was talking, I just looked it up in the Heritage Foundation voter fraud database. I love using this database, mainly because, in my opinion, it is more of an exercise in the hilarious than the nefarious. The examples that they've found are quite funny. And so I'd love to point out that one of the 3 examples of voter fraud that they have on file for Wyoming is a sitting representative in 1997 sold her house and used a false address to vote. And she was caught. Of course she was caught. You always get caught when you do this. So let's start there. You get caught if you try to commit voter fraud. And then secondly, absentee ballots are incredibly hard to fake. It's incredibly hard to fake someone's signature. I dare you to try and get a notary to sign off on a ballot if you are not the person you say you are. That's not going to work either. So there are lots and lots of security features that are involved in this process. And we have designed it to be detectable and to have massive deterrence, right? Like voter fraud is not something you want to mess around with. And it's not honestly economical. So if you're a campaign and you're trying to steal ballots or whatever, it's a lot cheaper to just try and campaign to get someone's votes. Because you would have to pay me and anyone I know an awful lot of money to risk this kind of federal and state felony. So keeping all of these things in mind, it is incredibly rare. And when it is, like I said, it's sort of more of these off the wall, strange situations where somebody tried to sneak one in and they get caught every time. There's only one real instance that I can think of where there was an organized attempt to commit voter fraud, and that was the North Carolina 2018 election, congressional election, and they got caught. And again, there's so many security features that include barcodes, signature verification. All of these things sort of put together create a system that is almost impervious to what we call wholesale fraud, rather than the retail fraud of just trying to maybe steal your neighbor's ballot or something. You're still going to get caught, but it might take a minute to catch it.
Well, I think that's so important. I mean, the bottom line is we have policies, procedures, and laws in place, and they are effective. And Chris, I see that you have something to add.
Yeah, I just want to say, the thing that bothers me about this is it's a distraction, and it's also exactly the opposite emphasis that we need to be having. So let me put it this way. There is a ton of evidence that voter fraud is not a factor in the outcome of elections throughout the country. There's also an overwhelming amount of evidence that voter participation of eligible voters is very bad, oftentimes suppressed, often because it's difficult for people to vote. What we should be focusing on is having as smooth a path as possible to voting and helping as many eligible voters vote. And I also want to say that oftentimes when people say voter fraud, it's in place of saying the quiet thing, which sometimes gets said out loud in Wyoming anyway. For example, a couple of years ago, I was sitting in a committee meeting when the Corporations Committee was considering a mail ballot election bill. And this bill wouldn't have required mail ballots. It just would have given county clerks the option to hold mail ballot elections if they felt like that was the best way to go for their community. And I heard representatives on that committee say things like, well, who are these people that are going to vote? Do they know anything about the issues? Are they informed? And I heard another person say, it should be a little difficult to vote. It should be a challenge to vote. And these are, I think, the real sentiments underpinning these conversations that and the advocacy against mail ballot elections. I think that saying fraud is a red herring and it's a distraction. And I know we have to respond to it because it's such a big deal culturally right now, but I just so wish we didn't have to.
Susan, I was going to say, Susan, you wanted to jump in.
I wanted to say that one case of voter fraud was a widow who voted her dead husband's ballot, and that was another one that was caught. Again, not a major issue.
And again, we have laws, we have policies, we have procedures in place, and I really appreciate, Chris, your reframing of the conversation, right? We do have to address it. This is the kind of forum in which we need to address it because it does come up so pervasively. But whatever we can do here today to debunk those myths and say it really is beneficial for all of us, for all of the reasons that all of you have said, but Audrey and Ricardo in particular, you've talked about what it means in terms of the policies that are being made and the decisions that are being made better reflecting our general population. I think that that's an incredibly important piece of it. While we're on the sort of like unpleasant conversations that keep coming up in this particular election, and before we shift wholesale into all of the great things that we could do for pro-voter policies, I do want to talk about safety and security at the polls. So not the sort of the safety and security of your ballot, but there has been a conversation obviously going on about whether or not there will be more electioneering or voter intimidation happening at the polls. We did put that question to the Secretary of State's office. I want to quick read the response. They said, every county in Wyoming is equipped with poll workers who have been trained to perform their duties at the polling place. These duties include understanding the law as it relates to acceptable and lawful polling place conduct. We have laws in place that address voter intimidation, electioneering, and specifically disrupting a polling place. If there is any conduct that violates these laws, the county clerk will contact local law enforcement if necessary to remedy the issue. And counties are well prepared and have working relationships with their local law enforcement. So Susan, I actually want to turn to you. I know you're an election judge. So what are some of the things that you have to think of when you're a poll worker? And do you anticipate that being different than in any other year in 2020?
I think we're more anxious about it in 2020. A couple of points. For years, we have we have been told that if a drunk comes in or someone is loud and obnoxious, we can call the clerk's office and law enforcement will come. One of the issues that I see is that if you're busy in a polling place, you don't really know what's going on in the peripheral of the polling place. So you need voters to tell you what's going on, and then you need to go from there. We saw at the demonstrations after George Floyd's murder that there were people who attempted to be and were obnoxious for the demonstrators. You know, big trucks, burping gas, making a lot of noise, etc. And I think that that is behavior that one could understandably call law enforcement on. And I think that you probably have seen copies of statutes and excerpts from the statutes talking about what's permissible or not permissible. So I think we haven't trained in Albany County yet, so I don't know how specifically they're going to address it at this point. And Wyoming, of course, is an open carry state. And so you can see people with revolvers, say, voting. Law enforcement, for instance, can come in and vote carrying a gun. And we had that happen at the polling place where I was. The other issue is that because of COVID, they have used some of the CARES money to buy gloves, to provide masks. There are plexiglass shields set up. We couldn't say to voters, you have to wear a mask, but I would generalize that the majority of people who were not wearing masks were young men. Sort of, yes. Macho young men.
Yeah,
Yes.
interesting. I could start a whole separate conversation about masculinity and choices that we're making, but that is a separate conversation. And I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm curious, Ricardo, if you would, you know, that there's this larger conversation about voter intimidation that Susan just tackled, but I'm curious also about sort of more subtle things that have gone on for a long time. You know, we heard from folks during the primary that people were being asked for their ID when that isn't something that you need to show to vote in this state. What are some other sort of civil rights-based things that people ought to know when they go to the polls, generally speaking? And then Chris and Susan, if there's specifics for Wyoming, you can jump in afterwards.
Great. Well, the efforts to dissuade people from voting span so long, loom so large that they actually reach back to well before, way earlier in the process. So if you're already about to vote, congrats, you made it far along in what is a challenge in a very unusual year. And I hope what you take away from these conversations is that we should be really excited to vote. This is an election, regardless of, you know, which side you're on. And there has been so much prep work done by election workers, volunteers, nonprofits, grassroots organizations to make sure that everyone has access to their ballot. That to me feels like an important reminder that I think we're collectively really excited, and you should make a plan to vote as soon as possible. If you can vote early, you should do that. If you can vote by mail, get that ballot in the drop box or in the, you know, to the elections office as soon as possible, because I think that's a really big piece of this. To your point, Jen, yeah, I mean, if you've managed to register, make your plan, find the place where you're voting, show up, or get your ballot in the mail, you've cleared a lot of these hurdles already. As it pertains to voter intimidation, let's just be clear that the slice of the proportionally, it just doesn't happen all that much. So it's good to know that any kind of attempt at intimidation is illegal. So if anyone is questioning about whether you should be there, whether that's your site, whether that your criminal background or your citizenship, that's not any vigilante's responsibility. There are plenty of processes to deal with that, and we've worked really hard at perfecting those. So if you somehow feel like something's off, contact an elections worker. You can also use the hotline that we're all dialed into, which is 866-VOTE. And all of the different, the Brennan Center, our counterpart, the Lawyers Committee, everyone is pulling together resources to have qualified, trained volunteers and lawyers ready at your disposal if you encounter any kind of an issue at the polls. But know that it's rare. Most people have a positive experience voting, and I hope that's what you're able to take away from this conversation.
Well, great. I appreciate that. And I think I would add into the conversation that the ACLU of Wyoming tomorrow will actually have a Know Your Rights training for voters. So if anybody's interested, we will drop that into the chat. We'll make sure it's in the follow-up information. I have a whole number of questions. Chris, I know that when you talked to Elections Director Schon, he gave you some information about how many absentee ballots have already been filed. Would you talk a little bit about that? And then we can pick up with Audrey about, again, the benefits of absentee and vote by mail.
Yeah, great. And for the record, I already voted absentee. And yeah, and I loved it because I got to spend time with my ballot. If there was a candidate that I didn't know, I had the time to Google that person, research what they said in newspaper articles. It's such a better way to vote. When you can spend time like that. But so yeah, elections director in the Secretary of State's office, Kai Schon, said that as of this morning, 66,715 absentee ballots have been cast in the general election. And that is compared to 62,272 total in 2018, the previous general election. So we are still, quite a ways out from the general election day. We have already surpassed the total number of absentee ballots cast in the previous general election. So that's a good sign, and I imagine that there will be quite an influx of more absentee ballots over the next few weeks.
I know the answer to this question, but Chris, would you remind us, did the Secretary of State mail absentee ballot request forms to everyone? And is that something they usually do?
So the Secretary of State's office mailed absentee ballot request forms to all registered voters in Wyoming. So you had to have been registered already to receive a form. And no, that's not something that the Wyoming Secretary of State's office regularly does. But this was in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and in an interest in raising awareness about the ability to cast an absentee ballot in Wyoming, where you don't have to explain yourself. You just ask for one and you get it. And maybe what you're getting at, Jen, there is this is one of the recommendations that the Equality State Policy Center sent to the Secretary of State's office. And prior to the elections, we were happy to see that they did do that one.
Susan, yeah.
The League of Women Voters is recommending that there be a permanent absentee ballot list so you don't have to make the request every single year. And I think that is something that would work very, very well here.
We love that. We are on board with that. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to jump in because I was going to kick it over to Audrey in a second here about absentee ballot and vote by mail, but go. Just
real quickly, the one problem that we still have to fix, though, is the state of Wyoming purges its voter rolls. So if you get sick and you don't vote in a general election, if you all of a sudden had to take an extra shift on election day and you weren't expecting it and you can't get to the polls, if your child care fell through, if your car broke down and you didn't vote in one general election, you are purged from the voter rolls. And
yes.
People don't know that they're not registered anymore. So,
but they send postcards out to every single person who they're going to purge. And they sent out over 6,000 postcards in Albany County in December, and they had 700 and some people say, oh, I still want to be voted. The other people did not. We have in Albany County a tremendous turnover, transient problem. There are so many people who move into town and move out again. And so the purging sounds dreadful, but I sound like I'm standing up for the establishment. But there's a reason for doing it, because where you live determines who you get to vote for. And it's very discouraging to go to vote and you can't vote there because you don't live there anymore.
Well, on that front, I'm going to ask Audrey to weigh in, because Colorado does it a little bit differently than we do it. And I did hear her say, as she was describing some of the pro-voter policies, that within your district, you can vote in various places. So Audrey, please give us some insight, give us some policy recommendations while you're at it.
Yeah, I'm so happy to. And, you know, when there's a saying that when you're in Hammer, everything tends to look like a nail. And so when you work at the National Vote at Home Institute, everything seems to fit under, I can fix that with a mail ballot. And like, in a lot of ways, all of these things you just mentioned can be mitigated or sort of fixed with a really nice, beautiful mail balloting system. So, you know, if you're sick, good thing that you have your ballot 3 weeks before. I actually, you know, I spiked a fever this weekend and was like very nervous that I might have been, you know, infected with COVID-19, and I got my ballot at the same time, but like I was able to sort of wait it out, get tested, and then I drop it off. And I'm still, you know, 2.5 weeks early. And I don't have to worry about having to pick up an extra shift at work or a family emergency or, you know, anything like that, because you have this spread of risk over a couple weeks. Some places it's much longer than what Colorado does. So that's sort of the first important thing that I like to note. But I think Susan's onto a lot of great ideas here. Permanent absentee lists are a great way to go, especially if you're not sort of ready to be mailing out ballots to everybody. Because, you know, to her point as well, list maintenance is very important. You don't want to be sending people incorrect ballots or people that are not eligible to vote a ballot. Like that actually, that can really hurt the system. Now, finding ways to sort of make that not only secure, but also equitable is the sweet spot. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And that's sort of, we might get a little too in the weeds there if I go that direction, but so I will spare you. But some of these other things that are just super important are same day voter registration. We have live e-poll books across the state. So if you walk into a place and you're like, I moved here a couple weeks ago and I don't really know what I'm doing, but I live here now. They say, awesome, welcome. We will sign you up to vote here and you can vote right now. And that's a piece that is not only super secure, but it makes things more accessible for these populations that could be transient, usually people of color. And it's also super helpful for allowing what we have as their traveling voting centers. The one here in Denver, they named it Holland Votes, which is a joke, which I like. But
you have to be old enough to know the joke.
Gotta be in the right generation there, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway, these sorts of traveling voter centers, they can be scheduled to show up on a Native American reservation. And they can sort of, you know, make sure that that population knows it's going to be there. They have very explicit instructions and dates and times where they can come vote in person, because maybe their mail service is working in a different way than sort of a regular suburban community, not unlike my own. So there's just a multitude of ways that you can make things secure and equitable and accessible at the same time. And we really like to push that because it's important to strike the balance there. And we never want to say that we're just going to throw out a security measure to make it easier to vote, because then you make the system less safe and then less people trust the system. And we don't want that either.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I'd love to pick up on this and go to you, Ricardo, and just talk about your thoughts on what are some other pro-voter policies that you've seen be really effective, and hit all the points that Audrey talked about, right, in terms of security and equitability and maintaining trust in the system, while at the same time giving more people access to democracy. Because as you pointed out earlier, if you've got your ballot, you've cleared a whole bunch of hurdles. So walk us through some of the what could happen policy-wise before you even get your ballot that is really pro-voter.
Well, I think we've hit on a number of those already, and the folks with the Vote at Home Institute and the League of Women Voters really do such a terrific job in pushing for those. But it looks like that ultimately if we think of voting as something that is really a right, a fundamental right in the United States, we're not having the conversations that Chris mentioned happen in the legislature along the lines of, well, who would vote if we switch to voting by mail? What would happen, then what would happen to the vote, right? It's not really for them to decide. Voting should be configured in a way that everyone gets to have a voice. So to that end, what we can do is design our system so that whether it's voting by mail, but in a way that really works for people, so that we're not then having to buy postage or apply for a request form and then we have to send back to finally get a ballot. Make sure that the deadline for us to drop our ballot in the mail is not, a week out, right? But that even if you drop it on election day before noon, it still counts because it's postmarked as having been turned in on election day. Automatic voter registration is enormously helpful so that, our government are structured to know where you are. If they need something from you, they know how to find you. So it should be to where our systems talk to each other and they know that this person now lives in Laramie, right? So we know that information because they are paying for water, they're paying taxes, they're paying electricity, they're using other services, they exist as a human being, and that should be enough. And we can do that. We have the systems and the know-how to make that work this way. Those are just a few, but maybe do away with voter registration. Why do we have to go through all these hurdles? Can you imagine if we treated gun sales the way that we treat voting in the United States? They would flip. So let's envision a democracy where we treat voting as a right, where every eligible voter can really buy into this national election piece and then walk backward from there. And I think we'll hit some of these pieces that Audrey and Susan are outlining. It's possible, we know how to do it. It's just a matter of putting those values at the center and having our people in elected office step up and embrace them.
Chris, please.
Yeah, just like to add a little regional context to what Ricardo just said, which is, so neighboring states like Idaho, Utah, Nebraska, and Kansas, they're among the vast majority of states that allow for online voter registration. 16 states, including Colorado, have automatic voter registration. And as Susan mentioned in the chat, North Dakota doesn't even require its citizens to register to vote. If you're eligible to vote, you just go and vote in North Dakota. And North Dakota is a pretty similar state to Wyoming in a lot of ways, low population, geographically and all those things. And it works just fine for them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I wasn't sure which one of you would talk about North Dakota, but I was certain that somebody was going to bring up North Dakota. And Susan also put in the chat that the Wyoming legislature did not support the automatic voter registration, the so-called motor voter bill. And so that was 1993, if I'm not mistaken, but you will all correct me. And as a result, their sort of compromise, so to speak, was to have same-day registration. I don't think that that's been revisited since then. I've certainly heard from folks that there is a perception that it somehow perpetuates fraud. That is something that we can dispel going forward, and also reframes the conversation in exactly the way that Chris unframed it for us. And I know, you know, as we're sort of winding down time, I would love to ask each of you, if you had one, like, what is your top, if you could only do one thing, if you could only give us one recommendation, if we could only carry one thing forward in the next legislative session, pretty sure I know what everybody's going to say, but it would be great to hear from each of you what we can be working at ESPC with our whole coalition and with grassroots folks across the state to advance so that we can get more Wyoming eligible voters and registered voters to the poll and engaged. I'm going to start with you, Audrey.
Wow.
Low-hanging fruit.
I literally have a list here of all of the things that I'm not kidding.
Go do it. Bring us the whole list.
Okay, I can do this very quickly. Wyoming should join ERIC. It's a state compact that shares voter data across states so that you can have a more secure update system. You should have automatic voter registration. You should do risk limiting audits that makes sure that your election is super secure. You should have online voter registration. You should have online requests for absentee ballots. You should have lots and lots of Dropbox options. You should be able to take your mail ballot to your polling place and turn it in there if you'd like to. You should pay for postage on return, like for mail ballots. You should accept postmarks. So if you put it in the mail on election day, you should be able to have that count. You should use signature verification as a means to verify who sent the ballot in. And then couple that with a really good cure process to make sure that it's equitable and that it's being implemented well. I guess I could kind of go on for a little while longer, but I think I'm going to stop there. There's so many things that you can do that actually don't cost a lot of money and are not super hard to get done. And they make your system super secure, but also like open up access to everyone. I'll stop now.
I love it. I appreciate it. It's a nice long list. And the nice thing about it is we're going to start to pare it down, I think is what we're going to do. Start with your list. And I'm going to end up with Chris, but I'm going to go to Ricardo next. Of the things that Audrey listed, are there items that you would prioritize and which ones are they? I can read them back.
I was getting ready to just say, I'll sign on to the Audrey reforms here. I'll do a couple of things. I mean, really, I think we should be thinking about the dream and how to make that, you know, what's our path to get in there? What does a Wyoming version of a pro-democracy package look like? And, you know, use your best framing, your best, your best work to try to put that into, to turn that into reality, right? It's what's the Wyoming way of making democracy updated and work for everyone. And it would look like something like that. It's democracy packages go through all the time. In 2018, there was a really powerful one that happened, that went through the legislature in, it was passed by voters in Michigan. In Missouri, voters passed a redistricting reforms. In Nevada, the legislature passed a set of changes to voting reform. So it really is possible, and we've already listed great examples from neighboring states. So what does the Wyoming update to our voting laws look like? That was my cop-out answer, because I know you asked me to wind it down. It's tough because I guess I do want to convey that that's what good democracy work looks like. It's not, you know, it's not that exciting. It's a lot of process that we improve to make it more accessible for people. Oh man, I don't know. That's my real answer. If I were forced to
No, I'm not going to force you. I love that answer, right? Yeah. You signed on to Audrey's package. This is the pro-democracy Wyoming style package. So then I will put it to Susan and Chris, because this is the big dream, right? Like it looks something like what they've described. And yet we live on the ground here in Wyoming. We are cognizant of what is or is not possible. We're coming up on a general session. And it would be great to move some pro-voter, pro-democracy policies forward. Susan, and then Chris for the last word. Susan, what would you gravitate towards that we can all work together and move forward in the coming session?
I think I'm not going to answer your question. I'm sorry to do that, but it seems to me one of the issues that we have in Wyoming is that we don't have enough candidates running for office. And so people are not excited about the elections, and they don't feel that an election is going to be a choice, because all you have is this one candidate for this office and one candidate for the office underneath. It's really discouraging. And so it seems to me that it is, you said, Ricardo, slow and methodical, and did you say boring? But getting people to run for office is really fundamental to make elections make a difference. And I think that many people in Wyoming do not feel that they need to vote because they don't think they're going to make a difference. And that is psychological rather than statutory, but it's a real issue that we haven't addressed at all.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, and we will probably need to come back for a whole nother panel to take that one apart. Chris, I'm gonna end with you. I know that in addition to talking about policy prescriptions, you're probably gonna wanna flag things like Audrey raised the point that our ballots, our absentee ballots, actually have to be in by the time the polls close on election day. You might also want to point out that if you have an absentee ballot, you have to put postage on it. You may have a couple of other like pro tips for people who are voting, but policy question first, pro tip second.
Sure. So, and so I'll just say, again, like what Audrey said is like the dream scenario. But the thing I want to point out is why. Why do we want to do these things? So we have two neighboring states that have at least some, maybe many, maybe all of the policies that Audrey mentioned, Colorado and Montana, and they both have higher than 60% voter turnout. Compare that to Wyoming, where we have 48% turnout. And I agree with what Susan said about candidates, but let's not also forget that in the recent primaries, we had multiple races that were decided by 5 votes, fewer than 10 votes. So, especially here in Wyoming, I mean, your voter participation can make a huge difference. Just like you and 4 of your friends could have swung a race, in your district, but if you would have been paying attention, right? So turnout matters, and there might be a chicken and the egg thing here too with the candidates versus the people voting. If you had more participation, you had a broader swath, a better representative sample of the population voting, the debates would be different, and ultimately the candidates would be different too. But that's both. You need both. You need contested races. You need turnout. Here in Wyoming, yes, if you're voting absentee ballot, get your ballot in as soon as possible. It is not counted if it's received by the county clerk after the polls close on November 3rd. So you need to, we're recommending 2 weeks in advance. So that's coming up. What day is this?
October 20th, we're telling people. Next Tuesday.
October 20th.
Get your ballots in the mail.
Yes, get your ballots in the mail by the 20th at the latest. And if you're mailing them, if you're showing up at the polls to vote, the only thing you need is to say who you are and where you live. You say your name and your address, and the election judges will match that up with their list, and that's all you need to show and do and prove, and you do not need to do anything else.
County clerks can start processing absentee ballots beginning, I believe it's the 30th of October. That is an Ed Buchanan directive. And so we're not going to have the kind of holdup that some states are anticipating.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Susan. Sorry, Chris, go ahead. And then we're going to.
Everything you can register at the polls. But if you do, you are going to have to bring an ID. And the ID is the simplest. But you can also bring, you know, your birth certificate and you know, another document. But if you have an ID, bring that. You need that to register. If you're not registered, you can register at the polls.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists. This has been fabulous. I could talk to you for, you know, like the rest of the evening. So we may have to put that together at some point. Thank you for the work that you're doing on the ground to engage voters across the country and across the state. And I'm going to turn it back over to Anna Marquise, who's going to bring us home.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. And thanks everyone for joining the People's Review Live. The Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We rely on charitable gifts to fund all of our work. Donations can be made on the website, which is equalitystate.org. It's in the chat. Or you can mail a check to 419 South 5th Street, Unit 1, Laramie, Wyoming 82070. And if you'd like to sponsor the series, please let us know. If you'd like to sign up for the newsletter, action alerts, or make a donation, use the web address in the chat. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next People's Review Live, where we'll be tackling more great topics. And don't forget, check your voter registration, make sure you're registered, and make a plan to vote. We dropped some voter resources in the chat, and we plan to include them on all of our correspondence from now until Election Day. Thanks, and have a great night.